Greetings everyone. Tonight we're delving into a piece of history seldom highlighted in standard academic texts, yet very much alive in dimly lit chambers and secluded monastic settings. We're exploring desire, intimacy, and transgressions during the medieval period. Before we begin, a word of caution. Survival in this era was precarious, not necessarily due to the explicitness of the subject matter, though that was a factor, but because possessing a keen intellect, coupled with even a flicker of carnal interest in medieval times, likely led to public humiliation, corporal punishment, or even immolation, depending on the prevailing judicial whims. So, before settling in, please consider liking this video and subscribing if you find genuine value in what I present. I'm also keen to know where you're joining from and what time it is in your location. Now, let's lower the lights, perhaps introduce a gentle ambient hum, and embark on this evening's exploration. Our journey commences not in a bustling marketplace or a rowdy tavern, but within the hallowed walls of a monastery. Surprisingly, perhaps, this is where we uncover a significant undercurrent of human frailty. The air is thick with the scent of beeswax, damp stone, and a subtle hint of medicinal herbs. A profound quiet pervades, so deep that every minor sound resonates like a seismic event. Yet, even here, shielded by imposing stone structures and the solemnity of sacred vows, Longsing persists like an inextinguishable ember. The monks are clad in woolen habits, their heads shaved in the distinctive tonsure pattern. They are sworn to forego earthly pleasures, with carnal desire cast as a predatory entity. Despite this, you observe Brother Thomas casting furtive glances at Sister Agnes during Mass, his fingers betraying a subtle tremor as she passes. She, in turn, grips her rosary with an intensity that seems beyond mere piety. It quickly becomes apparent that this is not an isolated incident. Medieval monasteries were arenas of internal conflict, where monks and nuns engaged in constant, arduous battles against their own thoughts and urges. The physical realm was the prime spiritual adversary, particularly as its influence couldn't be simply banished through fasting or cold ablutions. Confessionals bore witness to numerous sins of the flesh infractions, dreams that left garments stained, and private moments of contemplation before statues of saints that, in retrospect, offered little solace. Intriguingly, records exist, meticulously kept and remarkably candid, detailing these struggles. One account from the 12th century describes an abbot confessing to experiencing visions of nude women within the church during periods of prayer. These visions, as he admitted, were undeniably tempting. In one instance, he recounted being so overwhelmed by torment that he pressed his face against the frigid floor in an attempt to regain composure. Though he noted this proved ineffective, some monastic communities gained notoriety for their less than sanctimonious conduct. A notable case from 11th century France involved the entire male and female populations of a dual monastery being discovered in what can only be described as an intricate web of illicit relationships, and this description is not figurative. The ecclesiastical authorities responded by dissolving the institution, labeling the entire establishment a disguised brothel. The irony of this situation is compounded by the fact that monastic life was actively promoted as the ultimate refuge from sin. The solution to escaping carnal temptations? Easy. Take sacred vows, consume unappetizing fare, engage in repetitive chanting, and shave one's head. However, the outcome was far from as advertised. If anything, the enforced solitude exacerbated the issue. Consider the scenario: an absolute absence of external diversions, extended periods of introspection, and the crushing weight of enforced purity. This environment effectively created a crucible of intense psychological pressure. And it's crucial to understand that the women were not exempt from these struggles. Nuns, too, documented their challenges, sometimes cryptically, sometimes with stark clarity. One 14th century nun described her nightmares, wherein she was assailed by monstrous dark figures with fiery breath. Classic imagery of an incubus. She penned numerous prayers imploring divine intervention to fortify her soul against such nocturnal assaults. Historians continue to debate the extent to which these supernatural accounts were allegorical, rather than a genuine manifestation of unacknowledged desires. Some academics posit that attributing these experiences to demonic influence was a more palatable explanation than acknowledging feelings of carnal attraction and subsequent self-loathing. Let's momentarily shift our focus to a more peculiar aspect of monastic existence: Did you know that some monks actively train themselves in lucid dreaming techniques specifically to ward off lascivious imagery during sleep? This was essentially a medieval, guilt-infused version of dream yoga. A lesser-known monk named Heinrich asserted his ability to recite psalms within his dreams to suppress any seductive inclinations. Whether this claim held any truth is uncertain, but the very existence of such practices underscores the depth of their desperation. And then there's the undeniable presence of overt transgressions. Despite the stringent regulations, numerous monks and nuns engaged in clandestine romantic entanglements. This involved the clandestine exchange of letters, secret nocturnal rendezvous, and the utilization of hidden passages. In some instances, individuals were discovered with offspring, indeed, children. In certain convents, expectant nuns were discreetly sent away to undergo penance, and the resulting child would either be abandoned or surreptitiously adopted by local inhabitants. The official explanation often cited miraculous conception or demonic deception, a rather convenient narrative. Nevertheless, not all monastic figures were cautionary tales of moral failing. Some demonstrated profound commitment to repressing their desires, and a select few reportedly succeeded. Accounts exist of saints who were purportedly devoid of any sexual thoughts and others who claimed to have achieved complete purity. However, a lingering question remains. Was this genuine spiritual transcendence, or an exceptionally adept concealment of their true feelings, or perhaps a redefinition of purity within their private writings? Regardless, the experience of observing these lives evokes a complex duality, admiration for the sheer intensity of their struggle, and a measure of empathy for individuals condemned to believe that even a fleeting sexual thought guaranteed eternal damnation. This represents a formidable psychological burden, especially considering the fundamental human propensity for connection and attraction. In the year 1142, you depart through a discreet side entrance as the Vespers service commences, the rising chorus of chants echoing behind you like dissipating mist. Outside, the moon hangs low in the sky, and the distant call of a night bird breaks the silence. You are now venturing deeper into this medieval world, where the boundary between the sacred and the carnal becomes increasingly indistinct. Our next exploration will focus on saints whose visions would undoubtedly provoke considerable astonishment. You haven't journeyed far from the monastic confines before finding yourself immersed in another narrative. This one steeped in incense, mystery, the flickering glow of candles, and what could be described as feverish visions. Saints, those exemplars of holiness, were not entirely impervious to the allure of desire. In fact, as one scrutinizes their lives more closely, it becomes evident that many spent years engaged in what can only be characterized as deeply personal and at times overtly sensual confrontations with both the demonic and at other times with the divine. You find yourself adopting the perspective of a medieval adherent, a state of being poised between skepticism and captivated belief as you pore over the accounts of these holy figures, the vitas, as the church termed them. These were not merely dry moralistic summaries. They were replete with dramatic turns, seductive temptations, spectral apparitions, physical agony, and spiritual raptures that blurred disconcertingly with carnal ecstasy. Consider the case of Saint Anthony the Great. This devout individual retreated to the desert seeking to escape temptation, only to encounter an even greater abundance of it. According to his biographers, demons assailed him with visions of women ardently pursuing him. Their bodies shimmered, their eyes gleamed, and in a dramatic act of self-mortification, Anthony reportedly threw himself into a thicket of thorns to quell his impure thoughts. This was not a metaphorical act. He literally plunged into the thorny undergrowth. While the efficacy of this extreme measure remains debatable, one cannot overlook the sheer dedication it represents. And this phenomenon was not exclusive to male saints. The experiences of female saints often present even more bewildering accounts. Allow me to introduce Saint Catherine of Siena, who embraced a vow of virginity at the tender age of 7. As an adult, she claimed a spiritual union with Christ, even asserting the reception of a ring fashioned, purportedly, from the foreskin of Jesus. Yes, you read that correctly. Upon rereading, the detail remains. Medieval hagiography displayed a remarkable lack of restraint. Then there is Saint Teresa of Avila. While her life extended slightly beyond the medieval era, her writings encapsulate centuries of mystical exploration bordering on the erotic. She described an angel piercing her heart with a flaming dart, causing her to writhe in agony and bliss so profound that she felt utterly consumed. If this narrative bears a resemblance to a scene from a romantic novel involving divine chastisement, your intuition is not misplaced. Scholars continue to deliberate whether these visions were purely spiritual, or if Teresa channeled her suppressed desires into a metaphysical language. Some scholars even suggest she experienced out-of-body orgasmic episodes for which she lacked the appropriate terminology, hence framing them as divine ecstasies. These accounts were not relegated to obscure texts. They were widely disseminated, read extensively, and even utilized as instructional material for other devoted individuals. The overarching message was unambiguous. Achieving spiritual perfection necessitated a direct confrontation with carnal desire, and the method of overcoming it often involved enduring increasingly surreal and at times sexually charged afflictions. However, a particularly intriguing aspect that warrants attention is the observation that some saints appeared to derive pleasure from these visions. Certain passages transition from descriptions of horror to expressions of awe, from revulsion to wonder. Saint Lidwina, a mystic of the 13th century, recounted an instance where Christ kissed her on the lips in a manner that suggested romantic affection. In another vision, his hands caressed her heart, inducing a sensation of overwhelming warmth and the perception of divine music. While these experiences could be interpreted symbolically, it's highly probable that they also represented the only socially sanctioned framework available for a woman of that era to articulate profound sensual experiences. This leads to a significant ongoing debate. Were these saints genuinely transcending the physical realm, or were they ingeniously finding circumvented pathways? Several contemporary historians propose that these hallowed visions often provided the sole acceptable outlet for women to express their desires, their intimacies, and their pleasures. It can be viewed as a form of spiritual performance, where they adopted roles permitted by societal norms to convey sentiments they could not otherwise articulate openly. Even more remarkably, some of these visions mirrored prevalent erotic tropes of the period, such as fainting spells, breathless anticipation, and the sensation of being overcome and utterly helpless. The language of religious rapture became intertwined with erotic poetry and vice versa. Honestly, after a few hours spent delving into these accounts of devout individuals, one might mistake them for romantic dramas. One moment you're immersed in a nun's vision of being bathed in celestial radiance, and the next she's describing a sweetness far beyond any earthly sensation. It leads one to suspect these women possessed exceptionally vivid imaginations and a dearth of other diversions. Meanwhile, the church navigated a precarious balance. On one hand, these mystical encounters were considered evidence of divine favor. On the other, if a vision grew too sensuous, suspicions of heresy, madness, or even demonic influence were quick to surface. Many mystics, particularly women, trod that precarious path. Exhibit too much piety, and you risk being hailed as a living saint. Indulge too much in sensual descriptions, and you might find yourself facing interrogation. You step into a modest chapel to regain your composure. Adorning its walls is a mural depicting Saint Margaret gripping a dragon by its tail. Frankly, it's hardly an innocent portrayal. Everything in this era seemed imbued with dual meanings, which is precisely what makes it so captivating. Open discussion of sexuality was taboo, yet everyone understood the unspoken undercurrents. Saints, poets, even ecclesiastical leaders participated in this intricate game of coded language. And of course, not every saint emerged from the scrutiny unscathed. Saint Christina the Astonishing, whose very name hints at the extraordinary, was reputed to levitate, hurl herself into infernos, and plunge into frigid waters to resist temptation. Her life story reads like a medieval hallucination. Some scholars propose she suffered from epilepsy or a neurological disorder, and her visions were simply misunderstood. Others view her as a mystic genuinely grappling with the inherent conflicts between the corporeal and the spiritual, and a society that condemned both extremes. You emerge from the chapel as a distant bell tolls, a poignant reminder of how intricately time and ritual intertwined with longing in this period. These narratives serve not merely as edifying tales for the faithful, but as survival manuals, cautionary fables, and expressions of fervent wish fulfillment. If we're being entirely candid, they functioned as rather suggestive fan fiction, for those who found the Canterbury Tales too risque. By the time you resume your journey, the saints no longer appear as flawless paragons, but as weary mortals attempting to comprehend overwhelming inner drives. There's a peculiar comfort in this realization. Even those considered most divinely favored could not escape the pull of desire. They simply devised more elaborate poetic methods of wrestling with it. And speaking of poetic struggles, your next destination is the realm of courtly love, where knights languish, ladies strategize, and nobility is often less than it appears in the ballads. You arrive at a vast castle just as the sun descends behind the turrets, bathing the stonework in a warm, golden light that lends an air of romanticism it doesn't entirely possess. Inside, preparations for a grand feast are underway. Roasted meats, spiced wine, and abundant fruits are evident, and the melodious strumming of lutes and the melancholic recitation of poetry can already be heard. Welcome to the world of courtly love, a place where desire is celebrated, flirtation is elevated to an art form, and yet, paradoxically, very few seem to achieve consummation. You take a seat in the great hall, observing the participants in this peculiar ritual. Over there, a knight kneels before a noble woman, his eyes alight with passion, his voice trembling as he pledges unwavering fidelity. He extols her eyes, her grace, her fluid movements, comparing her to a swan gliding across a lake. All the expected pronouncements. She, in turn, accepts his adoration with a calculated air of detached amusement, a raised eyebrow, a smile that could signify kindness or perhaps a hint of cruelty. They exchange symbolic tokens, a glove, a scarf, occasionally a lock of hair. However, if he anticipates that this gesture will grant him access to her private chambers, he is sorely mistaken. This is courtly love in its refined, almost torturous iteration, and as you quickly ascertain, likely conceived by someone who relished emotional torment. Its essence lies not in fulfillment, but in the yearning, the idealized affection for someone unattainable or forbidden. Such unfulfilled longing, they believed, lent love its purity. You begin to ponder if this entire cultural phenomenon was merely the medieval equivalent of prolonged anticipation. The era's poets, the troubadours and troubadours, were masters of this craft. They journeyed from court to court, serenading audiences with tales of idealized, unattainable women and the exquisite agony of loving someone from afar. One of the most celebrated was Chrétien de Troyes, who gifted us with the narratives of Lancelot and Guinevere, and other classic scenarios where true love remains perpetually out of reach or must be concealed due to existing marital vows to kings or rival lords. While these stories were, in essence, fictional creations, they profoundly influenced the actual conduct of the nobility. Individuals emulated the behavior depicted in these tales. Ladies would engage in flirtation just sufficiently to inspire devotion, but never to the point of surrendering control. Knights would undertake perilous quests, participating in jousts, vanquishing mythical beasts, composing sonnets by candlelight, all in pursuit of a single smile or a whispered word. You start to suspect that perhaps the true reward was the performance itself, the notion that the act of desiring held a nobler status than possessing. However, here's the crucial revelation. All this is merely the surface. Delve a little deeper and you discover that these effusive declarations were frequently a polished veneer for very real romantic entanglements, particularly within the confines of the court, where marriages were often arranged for political expediency. Love frequently had to be sought elsewhere. You discreetly follow a few couples into secluded corridors, observing the moment their public personas dissolve when they believe themselves unobserved. The professed longing transforms into tender caresses. The eloquent poetry devolves into hushed whispers, and the celebrated noble restraint becomes a convenient pretext for slipping away behind tapestries. A particularly notable instance involves Eleanor of Aquitaine and her celebrated court of love. As one of the most influential women of the 12th century, she hosted gatherings where ladies would engage in debates about the nuances of romantic conduct, reminiscent of a medieval reality television show. Questions arose concerning the propriety of a man pursuing a married woman, the potential benefits of fostering jealousy, and methods for assessing a lover's fidelity. While these discussions appear polite and intellectual, it's crucial to recognize that many participants were themselves involved in extramarital affairs, often with the very knights composing those passionately penned verses. Nevertheless, this entire construct of courtly love adhered to a strict set of principles. A paramount rule was its supposed lack of physical intimacy, thereby circumventing official condemnation for sinfulness. Naturally, the Church viewed it with a degree of skepticism, deeming it suspiciously secular and focused on earthly desire rather than divine affection. Yet, it proved challenging to censure individuals for professing admiration for another's soul, especially when that admiration was expressed through such elegant metaphors. The boundaries, however, were in constant flux. You encounter a narrative about a nobleman who inflicted a dagger wound upon himself to demonstrate his devotion to a lady who had rejected his advances. Moved by his self-inflicted suffering, she agreed to a clandestine meeting. One might assume this is where intimacy would finally occur, but astonishingly, they merely conversed. She declared that he had captured her heart, and he pledged to remain her devoted servant until his demise, and that was the extent of it. Everyone involved, including yourself, was left feeling rather unfulfilled. Despite this, these relationships carried significant social weight. A single indiscreet flirtation could irrevocably damage reputations, shatter marriages, and even instigate conflicts, leading to jealous kings, cunning queens, and knights who changed allegiances. You observe this unfolding in slow motion, witnessing how a fleeting glance can morph into a rumor, and a rumor into a full-blown scandal. A lady of the court passes by and confides to you, "In matters of love, discretion is more powerful than desire." She speaks a profound truth. Furthermore, there exists a less conventional theory that you happen upon. Certain scholars posit that courtly love served as a sophisticated literary diversion, a smokescreen designed to facilitate real-world political negotiations. Noble women, frequently relegated to the role of pawns in strategically arranged marriages, utilized the rituals of courtly love to exert influence by selectively favoring, teasing, or publicly shaming individuals. In doing so, they subtly steered the social dynamics of the court. Consequently, that exchanged glove might have been far more than a mere token. It could have been a strategic chess move. Then there is the question of physical intimacy, or rather its conspicuous absence. Some historians argue that courtly love functioned as a precursor to erotic theater, a means of channeling desire into socially palatable expressions. Others maintain that sexual encounters did indeed occur, cleverly concealed behind layers of metaphor and poetic language so dense as to confound any watchful chaperones. After all, medieval texts rarely articulated matters directly. Instead of stating they consummated their desire, it might be phrased as he explored her garden with reverent delight, a rather veiled insinuation. By the close of the evening, you come to the realization that you have been observing an elaborate charade, a performance where everyone feigned an existence beyond the carnal, while discreetly maneuvering for physical access. Here, lust adopts the guise of longing. It is meticulously choreographed, deliberately restrained, yet somehow manages to ignite with the intensity of a wildfire, burning through silk, lace, and fluttering fans. You step out of the great hall into the cool night air, fragrant with the scent of roses and wine. Somewhere within, a poet continues his recitation to a duchess whose attention seems to have waned. Your path, however, leads elsewhere. You have witnessed the pretense of the nobility. Now it is time to observe the lives of the common folk. You need to understand how they navigated their existence without privacy, without influence, and without the embellishment of poetry. You depart from the opulent world of the aristocracy, leaving behind velvet draperies and lute music, abandoning the intricate dance of flirtation. The atmosphere now feels heavier, thick with the aroma of damp earth, wood smoke, and livestock. You find yourself in the heart of a medieval village, likely situated somewhere in northern Europe, perhaps England or France. The dwellings are compact and clustered together, constructed from timber and thatch, with virtually no concept of personal space, let alone privacy. Yet this lack of seclusion did not prevent the inhabitants from forming attachments, nurturing affection, or occasionally sharing a quiet closeness on chilly nights. Indeed, it often happened, though without the luxury of silken sheets or poetically encrypted verses. You cautiously peer into one of the cottages, stooping to clear the low doorway. The interior comprises a single room, furnished with a solitary bed, or perhaps two if the inhabitants are fortunate. Parents, children, and occasionally even a goat share the same space, sleeping within arm's reach of each other. This is where ingenuity comes into play. In certain regions, a custom known as bundling or bed courtship permitted young couples, often teenagers, to lie together in bed, fully clothed, for the purpose of conversation, building companionship, engaging compatibility. Yes, you heard that correctly. In shared beds, often separated by a wooden board or a coarse cloth, they engaged in a kind of closeness that, for its time, was surprisingly forward-thinking. The initial intention was strictly platonic companionship, a supervised closeness, but the reality for these teenagers, surrounded by the scent of hay, was often more nuanced. Curiosity, a natural part of youth, occasionally found expression in ways that went beyond quiet conversation, leading to what was euphemistically termed bundling turned to fumbling. Should a young woman find herself expecting, the societal expectation was for the man to marry her, and impromptu weddings were not an uncommon occurrence. It was also quietly understood that the bundling bag, though practical in design, was perhaps more symbolic than truly foolproof. What truly stands out is the deeply communal nature of life. In a society where personal space was minimal, the community served as both observer and quiet judge of romantic developments. Neighbors exchanged gossip, families kept careful watch, and a person's public standing could significantly influence the course of a courtship. One ritual involved village women meticulously examining the wedding night bedsheets for signs of consummation. A bloody sheet signified all was in order, while its absence would inevitably fuel the rumor mill, prompting speculation about whether clever brides had taken measures to fake the evidence and avoid scandal. Among the common folk, sexual activity wasn't cloaked in the same pretense of unblemished chastity often demanded of the nobility. It was an integrated aspect of life, approached with practicality, affection, and sometimes a sense of urgency. Couples would seek out secluded spots behind haystacks or within the woods, where the sounds of nature offered a flimsy cover for their stolen moments. While some were discovered, the repercussions were often less severe than one might anticipate. A minor financial penalty might accompany public acknowledgement of the transgression. It was generally accepted that strong desires wouldn't always await formal sanction from the church. Nevertheless, boundaries existed, and transgressing certain lines carried considerable risk. Adultery, particularly if it involved an individual of higher social standing, could result in banishment, corporal punishment, or even worse fates. Within the lower classes, however, sexual transgressions were typically managed at the community level. A curious custom known as charivari involved parading a man through the village on a donkey, accompanied by the din of banging pots and shouted insults, particularly if he had married a much younger woman or was suspected of infidelity. This event served as a blend of reprimand and public spectacle, a manifestation of petty grievances masked as righteous indignation. Yet, even within this context, a thread of humor and an earthy acceptance of life's complexities were present. A local midwife, a robust woman with a gap-toothed grin, confided that the Lord's sermons held less sway than the natural course of procreation. Having overseen numerous births regardless of marital status, she displayed little surprise at the varied circumstances. She even alluded to the discreet contributions of noblemen to the village's younger population, a phenomenon that resulted in children of mixed social strata, sometimes seamlessly integrated into the community, other times ostracized. Notably, marriage itself among these rural populations was not always a grand affair. Often, it was as simple as a handshake witnessed by others, a mutual agreement to share labor, sustenance, and a dwelling. While the church favored clerical involvement, local customs frequently held sway. Cohabitation and public recognition as a couple were often sufficient to establish a union, a form of marriage by consensus that offered surprising flexibility until it encountered stricter societal enforcement. It was understood that observant eyes were always present, even from the periphery. An elderly widow might share hushed accounts of "she vanished into the woods, never to return," young girls who sought refuge in the forest to escape the shame of an unplanned pregnancy, or who employed traditional remedies for family planning. The passing of secret herbs, teas to induce menstruation, and protective charms worn beneath skirts all spoke to the ways women sought to assert control over their lives in a world that often limited their autonomy. This leads to a rather peculiar historical detail. In certain regions of medieval Europe, young couples would carve inscriptions or sacred vows of love into tree bark. This act served not only as a romantic declaration, but also as a form of spiritual safeguard, an alternative to a priest's blessing when affordability was a concern. The trees, perceived as natural and enduring, offered a more accessible form of consecration than ecclesiastical approval. Observing such a tree, its bark etched with faded hearts and initials, one can only imagine the multitude of clandestine love stories it has silently witnessed. Scholars continue to debate the prevalence of premarital sexual activity among the peasantry. Some cite church records detailing numerous fines and punishments as evidence. Others argue that these records predominantly reflect the isolated incidents that drew public attention and censure. The consensus is that the codified regulations and the lived reality seldom aligned perfectly. Desire, it seems, has a persistent way of finding avenues for expression, thriving in the unseen spaces. In the heart of medieval villages, these unspoken realities profoundly shaped lives, often with a greater degree of candor and perhaps more humanity than the lofty pronouncements of aristocratic romance. Departing the village, with muddy boots and a mind filled with images of flickering fires, whispered vows, and clandestine embraces behind barn doors, the impression remains. While the common people lacked the finery of the nobility, they possessed a vibrant passion, a willingness to embrace risk, and moments of genuine tenderness etched into the very fabric of their existence. The journey now turns towards the cloisters, but with a twist. The focus shifts to the women, the nuns whose lives were far from solely dedicated to pious contemplation. Entering the serene confines of a convent through a creaking wooden gateway, one might anticipate an atmosphere of celestial hymns and fragrant incense. Instead, the senses are met with the sharp aroma of vinegar and the inviting scent of roasting onions emanating from the kitchen garden. The air, though clean, feels heavy with untold narratives. Nuns move through the courtyard with unpracticed elegance, their habits billowing in the breeze, their gazes lowered and their hands folded. Beneath this outward appearance of tranquility, however, lies a palpable energy, a vibrant humanity beating beneath layers of linen and Latin. This transformation of the convent into a sanctuary from worldly temptations, a haven for complete devotion to the divine, is acknowledged. While prayers, chants, periods of silence, and meticulous manuscript copying occupy the scheduled hours, it soon becomes apparent that this is more than just a spiritual refuge. It is a collective of women who think, feel, dream, and yes, occasionally indulge in fantasies, much like their secular counterparts in medieval society. Crucially, they meticulously documented these experiences. Within the convent library, where the air is thick with the scent of ancient parchment and beeswax, an elder sister, her eyes alight with quiet amusement at your inquisitiveness, reveals a rarely seen collection, the private writings of the nuns. These are not pronouncements of doctrine, nor psalm collections, nor dry theological analyses. Instead, she presents fragile diaries filled with scribbled accounts of longing, shame, prophetic visions, and desires, penned between periods of prayer and poetic composition. While some entries possess a spiritual dimension, it is often not in the manner one might conventionally expect. One account describes a dream in which the writer is embraced by the Virgin Mary with a tenderness that suggests an overwhelming rapture rather than simple maternal solace. Another entry details repeated kisses from an angelic being, leaving the narrator breathless upon waking, uncertain whether she has received a blessing or a curse. One nun writes of a fellow sister's hair, likened to golden wheat in summer, and the gentle pressure of her hand during communal prayer. The prose reads as a quiet, intimate, and almost melancholic expression of yearning. While nothing is explicitly stated, the unspoken undertones are undeniable. This phenomenon was not confined to a single institution. Across Europe, from England to Italy, scholars have uncovered correspondence in verses exchanged between nuns, some subtly coded, others remarkably forthright. A nun in Germany expressed her profound longing for the warmth of Sister Clara's embrace. Another, situated in a remote French convent, confessed to seeking divine forgiveness for harboring carnal fantasies while sharing a bed during the winter months. A moment of reflection is warranted here, sharing a bed. Indeed, convent dormitories were communal living spaces, often housing 2 or more nuns per straw mattress, particularly during colder periods. This arrangement was both practical and economical, and in some instances it inadvertently fostered opportunities for intimacy. While overt displays of affection were forbidden by the rules, enforcement was inconsistent, lacking the modern means of surveillance or forensic evidence. What existed was dim candlelight, heavy vestments, and the persistent presence of human need. Nonetheless, not all interactions remained veiled. Certain abbeys maintained remarkably candid records of disciplinary issues. One documented instance involved a nun discovered in the company of a visiting monk beneath a staircase. Another case reported a nun found with the daughter of a local butcher, who had been concealed within the convent grounds disguised as a laundry assistant. In most such cases, disciplinary measures typically involved temporary confinement, additional prayers, and a stern reprimand. However, when noble families were implicated, scandals were often meticulously concealed. Furthermore, there were the treasured love tokens, small crosses, carved amulets, and notes tucked within rosary pouches. One nun buried a letter at the base of a cherry tree, addressed to the individual whose voice haunted her dreams, never signing it. It was unnecessary. Everyone within the convent was aware of its intended recipient. However, these expressions were not solely driven by carnal desires or forbidden affections. Many of these women were intellectual powerhouses yearning for mental stimulation. They engaged with a wide range of texts, from Augustine and Plato to, when possible, Roman poets. They participated in theological debates long into the night, undertook textual translations, and penned mystical reflections that, upon closer examination, often resembled erotic poetry cloaked in the language of piety. One visionary nun described her soul being pierced by a divine flame, unfurling like a blossom towards the light, a metaphor that, in its intensity, strongly suggests a form of spiritual foreplay. As a curious piece of information for the day, consider Hildegard of Bingen, the renowned 12th century abbess, composer, and mystic. She once posited that a woman's soul could conceive from divine inspiration, a concept that some contemporary readers interpret as a manifestation of spiritual queerness. She shared an intense, perhaps romantic connection with a fellow nun named Richardus, a bond that dissolved into a deluge of heartbroken correspondence when Richardus was reassigned to a different religious house. Hildegard's expressions of sorrow read like a lament set to Latin verse. Naturally, contemporary academics engage in discussions about the true nature of these relationships. Were they amorous affairs, purely platonic friendships, or emotional coping strategies within an exclusively female environment? Did these women comprehend their own affections and desires in a manner analogous to how we articulate sexuality in the present day? There is no definitive resolution to these queries. What remains evident is that these individuals led richly complex emotional lives, a stark contrast to the idealized portrayal of demure, chaste angelic figures that ecclesiastical propaganda often promoted. Furthermore, it is worth noting that many women did not enter religious life by choice. Families frequently made this decision for their daughters as a matter of financial expediency or as a strategic political move. If a daughter was not considered attractive enough for a lucrative marriage, or if she had too many elder sisters already vying for advantageous unions, she was often sent to the convent. Some women found fulfillment in this path, while others did not. One discovered diary entry captures this sentiment with a single poignant sentence: "I do not love my vows, but I obey them." This simple admission carries more emotional weight than any sermon. And let us not overlook the occasional dissenters, the nonconformist nuns who would sneak out of their convent at night, frequent taverns, and even engage in romantic liaisons. In 14th century Italy, a group of nuns was apprehended while hosting masked balls within their cloister, complete with hired musicians. Upon the arrival of church officials, they discovered an abundance of wine, audible merriment, and a conspicuous absence of contrition. The women received admonishments naturally, but were not expelled. The reason? A number of them were related to bishops, a predictable outcome. As you retrace your steps through the cloisters, with moonlight filtering through the arched windows, the faint echo of a hymn drifts from the chapel. It is a beautiful, melancholic sound, yet beneath the melody lies the undeniable truth that these women, so frequently depicted as unblemished exemplars of virtue, were as brimming with yearning, internal conflict, creativity, and hidden histories as any individuals in society. perhaps even more so, secluded from the outside world, their only companions the flickering candlelight and each other. Next, you will find yourself entering a confession booth, where the atmosphere is heavy with the scent of incense and the hushed tones of whispered transgressions. On the other side of the partition, a priest awaits, one who might possess a more intimate understanding of temptation than one might initially assume. You step into the hushed, shadowed interior of a stone church, where stained glass windows cast fragmented pools of colored light upon the worn pews, and the aroma of centuries-old incense permeates every surface. The altar gleams in the distance, but your attention is drawn to a more secluded area, the confessional booth. It is a peculiar, small wooden structure, akin to a closet for secrets, with the weight of confessions embedded within its very grain. You slide inside, draw the curtain, and find yourself inhaling the same musty air as countless generations of penitents who have sought solace here before you. On the other side of the screen, a priest clears his throat. What then unfolds is not precisely what one might anticipate. In principle, the medieval confessional is intended as a sacred space, a conduit for spiritual purification, a ritual for laying bare one's most shameful desires before the divine. However, in practice, the situation becomes more intricate. This is because the individual behind the screen is not merely a man of faith. He is a human being with faculties of hearing and curiosity, and, to be candid, sometimes a questionable degree of self-control. Confessions could be astonishingly detailed. Individuals approach priests not only to implore forgiveness, but also to seek clarification on whether a particular act they had engaged in with their spouse, their neighbor, or a traveling musician technically constituted a sin. You overhear one such confession, a young man tremulously whispering that he permitted a girl to touch his most private part while bathing. The priest's response is not one of condemnation, but rather a series of inquisitive questions, some of which bear a closer resemblance to personal investigation than spiritual counsel. This is not entirely unexpected. Priests were often the most educated individuals in their communities, but this did not render them immune to carnal desires. Indeed, some had greater exposure to temptation than the average person. Parish priests were expected to observe celibacy, a mandate established by church law in the 12th century, yet enforcement was inconsistent, and rural areas were hardly teeming with vigilant bishops. Consequently, when the local priest took a mistress, the community generally turned a blind eye, unless his conduct became overly ostentatious. You encounter the account of Father Gerard, who was known for hearing certain women's confessions in private, and for taking an unusually extended period to do so. One widow confessed to him on a weekly basis, always after sunset, and neighbors reported observing candlelight in the rectory window well past midnight. Eventually, a bishop initiated an inquiry, and Gerard was quietly transferred to a monastic order in the north. There was no formal trial, no punishment, merely a change of location, and presumably, an entirely new flock of souls to guide. However, even priests with the best intentions were not entirely exempt from peculiar conduct. One particularly devout friar, Brother Luca, maintained a record where he meticulously documented the number of times his parishioners confessed sins of the flesh. He did not record their names, mind you, but rather the nature and frequency of these transgressions. The resulting data is quite unusual. He observed patterns such as a higher incidence of confessions related to self-gratification on Mondays, and married women reported experiencing impure dreams more frequently than unmarried maids. Whether this represented a spiritual census or an unhealthy fascination with the private lives of others is difficult to ascertain, and here is a particularly curious detail you uncover. Some priests assigned highly specific penances for sexual sins. These were not simple directives like reciting 5 Hail Marys, but rather actions such as walking barefoot to the chapel 3 times while reciting Psalm 51, or fasting for 40 days and sleeping exclusively on stones. In one particularly egregious instance, a man who confessed to bestiality was instructed to carry a candle larger than himself through the town during the celebration of Mass. Yes, truly. The intention was public humiliation, but whether it served as a deterrent to others is debatable. And it was not solely the laity who confided their secrets. Priests themselves occasionally confessed to one another in private or to their superiors, when guilt finally became overwhelming. There are documented instances of priests admitting to intimate relations with nuns, with widows, and even with their own household staff. Some expressed genuine regret. Others offered justifications. She was lonely. I believed we were united in God's eyes. One particularly audacious priest simply wrote, "It was good and I do not regret it." Naturally, not all priests were unchaste clergymen. Many approached their vows with utmost seriousness, or wrestled with their own desires, and confessed their inner turmoil with profound anguish. Yet, even they were not immune to suspicion. A priest who was considered too handsome, too gentle, or too amiable with women could face accusations of inappropriate conduct, irrespective of whether any transgression had actually occurred. In an era where sexual activity and sin were inextricably linked, even a cordial smile could portend a scandal. You also learn of female confessors. Though fewer in number, they did exist within certain religious orders, and the contrast in their approach is striking. They tended to be more stringent, more clinical, and less easily shocked. Some women, in fact, preferred to confess to a fellow woman, particularly when their sins involved matters of the body. Imagine attempting to describe a sensual dream involving Saint Sebastian to a flushed young priest. Now, envision confiding in someone who has experienced similar introspection. Nevertheless, confession often served less as a means of absolution and more as a method of control. The church amassed considerable influence by acting as the custodian of everyone's secrets. They possessed knowledge regarding who slept where, who harbored affections for whom, and who desired what, and they utilized this information not only to uphold moral order, but also to exert authority. A nobleman who confessed to adultery might be subtly advised to fund the construction of a new chapel. A baker who frequented brothels too often might unexpectedly lose his stall in the marketplace. Guilt effectively transformed into a form of currency, and here is where scholarly debate ignites. Some historians contend that the confessional booth functioned less as a sanctuary for spiritual healing and more as an instrument of psychological surveillance, an early iteration of institutional oversight that fostered an obsession with individual moral failings. Others maintain that it provided individuals with a release, a space to articulate matters for which they had no other avenue of expression. The truth, as is often the case, is likely a confluence of both perspectives. Confession served concurrently as a therapeutic session, a trap, a source of relief, and a potential risk. You finally depart the booth, the carved wood emitting a soft creak behind you. Outside, the sun is beginning its descent, and the sound of bells resonates across the town like an impending pronouncement. You have heard countless sins whispered into the darkness, and not all of them remained concealed. Some gave rise to gossip, others escalated into public scandal, and a select few shaped the collective perception of entire communities. As you traverse the courtyard, you realize that in this world, sin was not merely an action. It was a narrative, a confession awaiting utterance, a burden seeking transference to another. And next, you will find yourself standing in the town square as private indulgence transforms into a very public spectacle. The square is already alive with a palpable energy by the time you arrive, the sort of subdued, expectant murmur that precedes a storm, or in this instance, a public condemnation. You navigate through the assembled throng of villagers, cloaked merchants, and elderly women with toothless smiles and baskets at their feet. Every gaze is fixed upon a wooden platform at the center, where a pair of stocks has been prepared and freshly oiled. Adjacent to it stands a barrel brimming with spoiled vegetables. Welcome to the realm of medieval justice, where transgressions not only weigh upon the soul, but are also subjected to a full, agonizingly public performance. Today's unfortunate protagonist is a woman in her early 30s, her hair disheveled and her face flushed, not, you suspect, from embarrassment, but from sheer indignation. She stands accused of adultery, though the specifics of the accusation are nebulous. The man involved is conspicuously absent. He invariably is. She, however, is about to endure an afternoon confined within the stocks, her ankles and wrists secured in place, while the townspeople engage in their customary pastime, judging, jeering, and pelting her with objects. You sense it immediately. This is not about dispensing justice. It is about staging a spectacle. The entire community has gathered not merely to punish sin, but to revel in its exposure. Giggles erupt as children heft mud-caked turnips. A boisterous, drunken cobbler shouts lewd remarks before nearly toppling into a hog pen. Yet, the scene isn't solely one of merriment. A pervasive undercurrent of cruelty saturates the air. The assembled masses revel in witnessing someone's humiliation, particularly a woman who dared to harbor desires deemed improper. Public retribution for perceived sexual transgressions was a disturbingly prevalent feature of medieval urban life. Infidelity, premarital relations, and even suggestive conversation could result in being placed in the stocks, or worse. Penalties range from mere monetary fines or public floggings to banishment, the shearing of hair, or the searing of flesh with a brand. The severity and nature of these punishments fluctuated based on geographical location, social standing, and gender. Nevertheless, the underlying message remained consistent. Licentiousness was a perilous indulgence, and those who succumbed to it should anticipate a reckoning. It becomes apparent that married women bore the brunt of these severe penalties. A wife's deviation, even if only emotional, was viewed as a profound betrayal, not only of her husband but of the entire societal structure. Conversely, a man could frequently escape consequences for an affair, especially if he claimed to have been enticed by the woman. The historical records starkly illustrate this disparity. Men apprehended in the company of prostitutes might face a fine. Women identified as prostitutes, however, could be subjected to whipping, branding, or compelled to adorn themselves in garments designed to elicit scorn. In one particular municipality, women accused of such offenses were required to wear striped hoods whenever they appeared in public, a visible scarlet emblem stitched onto their attire. Moreover, these punitive measures were not exclusively reserved for actual carnal acts. Court documents reveal the public degradation of a man accused of secretly adopting female attire. His alleged transgression involved donning his wife's dress while performing household chores and purportedly dancing in solitude. There was no sexual contact, no victim, yet he was forcibly paraded through the town square, compelled to wear women's clothing before the assembled populace while being pelted with animal waste. The underlying issue was not morality, but the stringent enforcement of societal norms, the insistence on conformity to predetermined roles, and the subjugation of individual identity to prescribed gender expectations. Consider also the case of the cellar courtesan, a woman who operated an unlicensed establishment from her cellar. Upon her discovery, she was not subjected to execution or imprisonment. Instead, she was publicly paraded through the town in a cart, bearing a sign that declared her purveyor of pleasures. This form of punishment was favored by the church, as it served not only to shame, but also to serve as a potent warning. Her neighbors, acquaintances, and perhaps even former patrons observed her procession in hushed silence, their expressions carefully devoid of emotion. No one wished to become the next target. Nevertheless, not all public punishments were reserved for egregious offenses. Occasionally, individuals were brought before the crowd for merely engaging in overly flirtatious behavior or making too bold an innuendo. In Norwich, one woman faced public censure in the stocks for remarking that a merchant's apprentice was ripe fruit in the marketplace. Her true offense, it transpired, was making this comment in the presence of a clergyman's wife. A fine distinction existed between playful banter and outright transgression, and the presence of the right listener often determined the outcome. Here is an unusual and almost unbelievable detail for the evening. In certain regions of medieval France, married couples caught in disputes over infidelity were compelled to publicly reconcile. They would be escorted to the market square, sometimes in chains, and forced to prostrate themselves before each other, confess their failings, and then embrace. Refusal to comply carried the risk of more severe penalties. Imagine the indignity of being forced to offer an apology with halitosis under the watchful eyes of half the town. Welcome to the romanticized era of the Middle Ages. Scholarly discourse remains divided on whether these public spectacles effectively deterred sinful behavior or merely served as an outlet, a mechanism for communities to reinforce their values and ostracize those who deviated. Certain historians posit that the public nature of these events lent them a ritualistic, almost theatrical quality, with their primary objective being not justice, but communal solidarity. They suggest that by collectively condemning an individual, people could find solace regarding their own concealed transgressions. Others contend that these displays were more about the assertion of power, a means of reminding the populace who dictated the rules and who possessed the authority to break them. Back in the square, The woman in the stocks has fallen silent. Her gaze is fixed on a point far beyond the jeering throng. The vegetable projectiles have ceased. The crowd's attention is waning. Someone begins to play a flute. The moment has passed. Tomorrow another will occupy her position. Perhaps a drunkard, a petty thief, or another paramour who miscalculated their affections at the wrong juncture. You withdraw from the square, your boots crunching on discarded cabbage leaves and the remnants of broken pride. The sun is dipping low, casting elongated shadows. It is peculiar how readily pleasure transforms into punishment in this setting, how the objects of human desire become the instruments of their own torment. Yet, despite the inherent risks, the craving persists. Next, we venture into darker realms where desire is not merely punished but demonized. A woman is poised to stand trial, accused of consorting with infernal entities. It may be prudent to keep your religious symbols close at hand. You approach the outskirts of a village precisely as torches are being ignited. Their flickering flames cast dancing, distorted shadows upon the timber-framed dwellings. The atmosphere is heavy with the scent of damp earth and wood smoke, but an additional, sharper aroma underlies it all. Fear. It drifts through the streets like a disorienting mist, intensifying as it nears the church, where a considerable crowd has congregated. Their purpose is not devotion. They are here for a trial. And not merely any trial. This is the kind where allegations possess a far greater potency than verifiable facts, and where malevolent spirits are assigned specific identities. A woman stands accused of carnal relations with the devil himself. Her name is Isabo. She is in her mid-30s, a widowed practitioner of herbalism and a mother of two. Unfortunate for her, she is also attractive, self-reliant, and rumored to possess knowledge of plants that induce menstruation or pacify unruly spouses. In this era, such attributes are sufficient grounds for being branded a witch. However, as you push through the throng and catch a glimpse of her, her hands bound, a tear in her sleeve, her eyes blazing with defiance, it becomes evident that this matter extends beyond mere herbal remedies or local gossip. Someone has accused her of engaging in sexual activity with a demon, and the consensus appears disturbingly eager to embrace this accusation. The priest, his chest puffed out with self-righteousness and his beard smelling of oil, enunciates the charges in a voice that wavers just enough to suggest a theatrical performance. She did engage in relations with a demon in human guise. She did permit this entity to enter her body through unholy means. She did utter sounds of pleasure rather than pain. The crowd stirs. Murmurs ripple through their ranks. Some make the sign of the cross. Others betray an unsettling curiosity. You find yourself leaning closer, not solely out of voyeurism, though perhaps a degree of that is present. It is because you are familiar with the trajectory of such narratives. Isabo will not merely be interrogated about her spiritual state. They will demand specifics. What was the demon's appearance? Did it possess claws or hooves? Did it speak in foreign tongues or whisper seductive endearments into her ear? And yes, these are precisely the questions being posed at this very moment, with a notary meticulously recording every detail. What is astonishing is the often elaborate nature of these accounts of demonic intercourse. Inquisition records are replete with testimonies from women describing nocturnal visitations by otherworldly beings. Some were depicted as comely, others as monstrous. Some presented themselves as lovers, while others acted as aggressors. Some tempted with gentle words and warm caresses. Others intruded upon dreams like an insidious malady. Regardless of the women's descriptions, the church possessed a preordained framework. These were identified as incubi, malevolent entities that preyed upon women, tempting them into sin, appropriating their vital essence, and utilizing it to propagate further wickedness. This convenient explanation encompassed everything from episodes of sleep paralysis to carnal urges, and even the presence of damp sheets in the morning. You hear Isabo's voice pierce the din of the crowd, a tone of defiance tinged with tremor. She asserts that the devil appeared in the form of her deceased husband. She recounts dreaming of him touching her, kissing her, and lying beside her, just as he had in life. She claims it felt authentic and that she wished it were real. In that instant, the crowd's disposition shifts once more. Some display sympathy, while others recoil in horror, for she is admitted to the most damning transgression of all. She found pleasure in it. The irony here is almost palpable. The same clerical authorities who condemn carnal desire also subscribe to the notion that demons dedicate their efforts to seducing individuals, particularly women, especially during the night, and frequently in ways that uncannily mirror suppressed human fantasies. There is a darkly comedic element to this, or perhaps it is tragic, or a combination of both, and then commences the examination. Yes, the physical examination. A midwife is summoned to scrutinize a Sabo's body for the presence of a witch's mark, a mole, a blemish, or a patch of skin devoid of sensation. You observe her as she is compelled to disrobe under the stark torchlight, her body subjected to the scrutiny of strangers seeking evidence of demonic nurturing. The process is intrusive, deeply humiliating, and, most critically, treated with utmost seriousness. For if any mark is discovered, however insignificant, the outcome is predetermined, and indeed, they find one. A small freckle on her inner thigh, that is all it takes. The priest proclaims it the devil's kiss. In that moment, the weight of the accusation becomes an insurmountable burden. However, this is where scholarly debate intensifies. Did these women genuinely believe they had cohabited with demons? Were they recounting vivid dreams interpreted through a lens of religious terror, or fabricating narratives under duress? Or were these confessions entirely shaped by their interrogators, with desperate women uttering whatever they perceived would alleviate their suffering, or conform to the expected truth? Some historians contend that these were simply erotic dreams, misunderstood by both the dreamer and the prevailing societal context. Others propose that the church itself projected its anxieties surrounding sexuality onto the accused as a means of controlling not just perceived sin, but also female independence. Because here's the crucial point. Many of these so-called witches were not inherently seductive or practitioners of dark arts. They were healers, widows, midwives, herbalists, women who lived independently, possessed considerable knowledge, or refused to yield to patriarchal authority. Their true transgression wasn't associating with dark entities, it was failing to conform to societal expectations. Lust became the convenient accusation because it lent the narrative a titillating, attention-grabbing quality that was impossible to verify or deny. Furthermore, if a woman derived pleasure from such encounters, she was deemed even more perilous, as a woman who enjoyed intimacy was seemingly on the verge of damnation. You uncover a disturbing detail within an archaic judicial record. During certain proceedings, women were compelled to articulate the sensation of the demon's essence within them. The prevailing assumption was that it would feel frigid, serving as irrefutable proof of infernal origins. Any assertion of warmth or any hesitation was interpreted as a sign of deceit. This illustrates the extreme measures the church would employ, utilizing the imaginary temperature of semen as an instrument of condemnation. The situation leaves you uncertain whether to erupt in laughter or despair. As the flickering torchlight illuminates the town square, the pronouncement of the verdict echoes, guilty. Izab is condemned to public humiliation and physical punishment. She will be paraded through the streets, barefoot and clad in a penitent's garment, carrying a candle exceeding her own height. Should she endure this degradation, she might be permitted to return to her residence, or she could vanish, much like countless others consumed by flames without official record. You retreat as the onlookers disperse, their minds abuzz, eager to embellish the tale for the following day's conversations. Some murmur that Isizabo possessed the ability to fly at night, while others insist she gave birth to a toad. The boundary between carnal desire and witchcraft is exceedingly fine and acutely defined in this place. Next, your attention will shift to the implements created to preempt such transgressions, devices intended for virtue, control, and perhaps a hint of perversion. Indeed, it is time to examine the subject of chastity belts. You find yourself within a confined space at the rear of a fortified structure, its stone walls exuding dampness and its ceiling so low it necessitates a stoop. Upon a wooden surface rests the object of your interest, catching a solitary beam of sunlight, appearing almost as a celestial jest. It is a chastity belt, fashioned from iron and lined with leather, radiating a chilling touch. A frontal plate covering the entirety possesses a cruel elegance, perforated with apertures for hygiene, or so it is claimed, and secured at the hips by a lock comparable in size to a young goat. Welcome to the peculiar nexus of desire, apprehension, and medieval ingenuity. The legend of the chastity belt holds significant sway. You have likely encountered it in numerous iterations. Tales of noble knights securing their wives before embarking on crusades, of women encased in metallic undergarments to preserve their purity, of keys worn around husbands' necks like macabre wedding bands. It possesses all the elements of a grim fairy tale. However, upon closer inspection, a curious observation emerges. This particular belt appears excessively ornate, remarkably well preserved, almost as if crafted for display rather than daily wear. This initial detail suggests that the reality of these devices is far more complex than initially perceived. Scholars continue to debate the extent of chastity belt usage, or even if they were employed at all. While museum exhibits and occasional Renaissance drawings depict women bound in these instruments of shame exist, the earliest surviving physical examples largely date from the 15th century onward, and some bear the hallmarks of 19th century fabrications, designed to elicit titillation rather than terror. It is conceivable that certain medieval chastity belts are the historical equivalent of costume accessories for Victorian gentlemen with peculiar inclinations. Nevertheless, the concept itself had precedent. The Church harbored a profound fixation on regulating female sexuality, and chastity was virtually a form of currency. Virginity transcended a mere moral state. It served as a crucial element in marital negotiations, a symbol of familial honor and a theological ideal. Consequently, the notion of literally locking it away seamlessly integrated into the prevailing culture of control. Regardless of whether women actually wore iron garments of this nature, the threat, the symbolic representation, and the underlying obsession were undeniably potent. You peruse ancient manuscripts, encountering a few scattered references. None of them present a particularly favorable portrayal. One Italian text recounts the story of an envious merchant who commissioned a belt from a smith to safeguard the virtue of his youthful wife. Another narrative details a suspicious nobleman who mandated that his daughters be secured whenever they ventured beyond their estate. Crucially, these accounts omit any information regarding the duration of wear, methods of bathing, or the management of infections. You begin to suspect that such details were either deliberately omitted or entirely fabricated. Yet stranger facts also come to light. Certain belts were engineered not merely to prevent carnal union, but to preclude any sensation of pleasure. One design incorporates small protrusions on its inner surface, akin to a reversed porcupine. Another features a mechanism that renders normal ambulation exceedingly difficult. Some researchers posit that these were devices of punishment, employed to discipline recalcitrant women or sex workers in particularly unforgiving urban centers, rather than preventative measures. Whether these instances represented isolated incidents or a more widespread practice remains a subject of intense debate. Furthermore, the issue was not exclusively confined to women. You chance upon a sketch of a male chastity device, an iron codpiece resembling a meat grinder. It appears that some men were compelled to wear these during periods of penance or by their wives as retribution for infidelity. There is even a peculiar, possibly apocryphal, account of a young monk who implored his abbot for a similar restraint to help him manage his urges. That demonstrates a remarkable dedication to a cause. Despite the limited or perhaps absent physical evidence, the concept of the chastity belt loomed large in the medieval consciousness. Poets composed verses about it, preachers issued warnings, and satirists mocked it. A medieval French ballad describes a woman who outwitted the belt by bribing a locksmith, subsequently engaging in intimacy with 3 different gentlemen before the morning prayers. Another jest tells of a knight returning from the Holy Land to discover his wife not only pregnant but still wearing the belt, with the key still attached to his own person. The implied message is that where there is a will, there is a way around any obstacle. You discover a curious record from Nuremberg dating back to the 16th century, detailing a man who attempted to sell a device of virtue in a public marketplace. The city council ordered him publicly whipped, not for the immorality of the device itself, but because the entire concept was deemed fraudulent and absurd. It seems that, even then, individuals questioned the practicality of encasing someone in medieval Tupperware and expecting a favorable outcome. Modern academics often contend that the chastity belt evolved into a more symbolic entity than a functional one, serving as a metaphor for control, a tool for propaganda, and a cautionary reminder. By the time the Renaissance arrived, the image of the belt was frequently incorporated into paintings and pamphlets, functioning more as a commentary on jealousy, power, and hypocrisy than as a reflection of actual usage. In this regard, it shares kinship with the scold's bridle or the shame flute, devices that may have existed but whose legends significantly overshadow their practical application. Yet, as you hold a replica of one in your hands, its cool, considerable weight, and its impossibly uncomfortable design, you realize something profound. Whether real or imagined, it evokes a medieval sensibility, brutal, controlling, and deeply mistrustful of the human body. This perfectly aligns with the world you have been exploring, a world where sin is both feared and punished, and where it perpetually lurks just beneath the veneer of virtue. The actual use of such a device might be less significant than the pervasive belief that its use was indeed possible. You depart from the fortress, traversing a courtyard where lovers once danced beneath banners and amidst suspicion. Your thoughts are a whirlwind of iron and fire, grappling with the absurdity of attempting to suppress desire by locking it away and pretending that such a measure would suffice to make it vanish. You are now en route to a wedding, not a union born of affection, but one dictated by obligation. The attendees, it seems, are more captivated by the prospect of the bridal linens than by the bride and groom themselves. You arrive precisely as the wedding feast commences, a whirlwind of roasted meats, sweet, viscous wine, laughter tinged with the aroma of onions, and nobles adorned in velvet, their merriment perhaps a touch too boisterous. The bride and groom are seated beneath a canopy of embroidered fabric, appearing like two strangers thrust into the world's most uncomfortable team-building exercise. She is pale and rigid, her gaze fixed on her hands as if attempting to dissolve into thin air. He, already several goblets into his libations, sports a grin at something that is likely not genuinely amusing. No one present appears concerned with the concept of love. Their anticipation is reserved for the true spectacle, the bedding ceremony. This is the moment when all pretense dissolves, and the newly married couple is escorted, often publicly, to their marital chamber. The assembled crowd makes no effort to conceal their eagerness. They chant songs, exchange jests, and deliver crude rhymes involving fruits and animals. If this situation strikes you as disturbingly intrusive, it is because it is. However, in medieval Europe, this was considered standard practice. A marriage was not deemed legally valid until it had been consummated, and at times, proof of this consummation was not merely expected but actively required. You follow the procession up narrow stairways illuminated by flickering candles, where the newlyweds are deposited into their chamber, much like livestock into a pen. Onlookers, comprising nobles, clergy, servants, and even the bride's aunt, congregate around the bed as the couple disrobes. Protocols are, of course, in place. No physical contact, only observation, encouragement, and gentle teasing. Some guests scatter flower petals, one musician plays a lute. The scene is undeniably surreal. The couple settles beneath the sheets, and then the curtains are partially drawn, as everyone eagerly awaits the moment of completion. One might expect such a public display to dampen the romantic mood, but that was not the intention. This ritual was not about fostering intimacy, it was about establishing legitimacy. Marriages in the medieval era were not unions based on romantic sentiment. They were economic pacts, political maneuvers, or strategic arrangements for the transfer of land and titles. To render them legally binding, evidence of consummation was essential. This brings us to the notorious inspection of the bridal sheet. Following the culmination of a union, or in certain instances, a claim thereof, the marriage linens were often exhibited publicly, typically outside the marital dwelling, serving as visual affirmation of the bride's virginity through any potential bloodstains. Red markings were interpreted as symbols of purity, integrity, and a sound marital investment, signifying the absence of any prior sexual relations. Conversely, the lack of such evidence posed a significant challenge. Whispers could escalate into rumors, dowries might be rescinded, and family feuds could erupt. In one documented occurrence, a groom promptly nullified the matrimonial contract and demanded a refund. The young bride, barely 15, saw her family take measures to protect their reputation when questions arose about the wedding. In time, the matter was settled to the satisfaction of all parties. As was well known at the time, the customs surrounding marriage involved certain expectations, and families took these matters seriously. Historical accounts mention how some would go to great lengths to observe tradition properly, occasionally with assistance from household staff. There are even records of careful preparations being made in advance of the ceremony. These social conventions were so deeply ingrained that maintaining proper appearances became a matter of great importance. The groom's presumed virginity, however, was a matter of little concern. Indeed, it was frequently anticipated that he would not be a virgin. Men were often advised to gain experience prior to matrimony, sometimes through liaisons with courtesans to ensure their marital performance. A treatise from a Spanish physician cautioned newlywed husbands against excessive ardor and uncontrolled haste, lest the bride remain unfulfilled and suspicious. Thus, while she was expected to enter the marriage undefiled, he was anticipated to be a seasoned participant. This disparity clearly indicates an unequal footing. A particularly unusual custom from Central Europe involved the bride's mother remaining present in the marital chamber, not to witness the consummation, but to ensure decorum. She would occupy a corner chair, her gaze politely averted, hands clasped, and would hum softly, as if this proximity somehow facilitated propriety. In other instances, a clergyman would formally bless the marriage bed, anointing it with holy water, and subsequently offer guidance to the newlyweds before discreetly departing. His parting words would likely have been an admonition to be fruitful and a reminder of divine observation. This undoubtedly placed immense pressure on the couple. Here is a curious anecdote for your consideration. In certain regions of medieval Scandinavia, if a marriage was not consummated within 3 days, it could be legally annulled, and this was subject to verification. One account recounts a young noblewoman whose husband exhibited excessive timidity or a distinct lack of interest in her. On the 4th day, a bishop dispatched an investigator to their bedroom. Upon finding the linens unstained and the servants visibly disappointed, the marriage was dissolved. The husband subsequently entered a monastic order, while the bride remarried her cousin a week later. Even in the absence of formal inspections, rumors posed a significant threat. A newly married woman who appeared overly jovial or displayed signs of physical discomfort could easily become the subject of malicious gossip. If she exhibited a limp, some speculated it indicated a prior loss of virginity. Conversely, an excessive bloom of health might suggest an unrestrained enjoyment of marital intimacy, which was equally viewed with suspicion. Regardless of the specific manifestation, there existed a pervasive obsession with intimate details that were decidedly none of the public's concern. This continues to fuel ongoing scholarly debate. To what extent were these public bedding rituals a genuine practice versus a theatrical tradition? Some historians contend that such public displays were more prevalent among the aristocracy and largely served symbolic purposes. Others maintain that these events occurred even within middle-class households, with neighbors peeking in to observe. There is even a theory suggesting that some of these accounts are later fabrications, with Renaissance authors perhaps mocking past customs. However, regardless of the truth, the underlying message remained unequivocal. One's body was not solely a private entity, but rather proof of status, a critical component in a legal transaction. As the chamber grows quiet and the guests return to their revelry, you steal a glance through a parting in the drapery. The bride remains motionless, her eyes wide open. The groom slumbers, snoring softly. At the foot of the bed, the folded sheet is already being scrutinized by the nursemaid. Whether it bears any crimson marks or not, a judgment will inevitably be rendered. You retreat downstairs, the strains of music resuming, a sense of unease settling in your stomach. It is not the fare that causes this disquiet, but the profound realization that nothing about this occasion was truly private, neither the vows exchanged, nor the marital bed, nor the affection, assuming it even existed. Next, you find yourself seeking solace in a church pew, eager to hear the clergy's pronouncements on these matters. Be forewarned, their message is unlikely to be conciliatory, and the impending sermon promises to induce regret for one's very existence. You slip into the rear of the church just as the priest ascends the pulpit, his robe swishing like a curtain drawing back on a solitary moralistic performance. The pews are densely packed, with commoners, tradespeople, and a smattering of nobility assembled for the Sunday address. Even the air seems heavy, saturated with dust, incense, and pervasive anxiety. The priest clears his throat, extends his arms with dramatic flair, and commences his discourse on the subject of lust. Once more, his opening is a cautionary declaration. The human form, he intones, is merely a vessel susceptible to temptation, with lust serving as its relentless captain, steering individuals directly toward perdition. You settle back, a mixture of curiosity and trepidation about what is to follow. Let it be known, the forthcoming admonition will not be subtle. The sermon proceeds with the relentless rhythm of a war drum. Any sexual activity outside the bonds of matrimony is deemed sinful. Likewise, sexual intercourse within marriage, if not intended for procreation, also constitutes sin. The mere contemplation of such acts is sinful, and a glance of desire elevates the transgression to a double sin. One can almost sense the collective effort of the entire congregation to suppress any recollections of the previous night. The Church, particularly during the later medieval period, embarked on an unyielding campaign to regulate the human body, with its most vigorous efforts concentrated on the domain of sexuality. Upon reviewing some of the didactic materials employed in confessions and sermons, one encounters descriptions more vivid than those found in any romantic novel. These texts, meticulously, categorize sins, detailing the specifics of posture, frequency of intercourse, and even the emotional state during the act. Experiencing pleasure, it was asserted, compounded the sin. Engaging in sexual activity with the intention of mutual satisfaction was practically equated with Satanism. Indeed, official lists of transgressions existed. One document dating from the 13th century enumerates over 30 prohibited sexual positions, complete with prescribed penalties. Some confessors advised couples that only the missionary position was permissible. Others harbored reservations even about this, deeming excessive moaning suspect. A renowned preacher famously cautioned his flock that even a kiss involving the tongue could invoke demonic presence. Glancing around the church, one is compelled to question how procreation was achieved at all. The priest continues his thunderous pronouncements, quoting Augustine, the seminal figure in Christian guilt, who asserted that the sole justification for sexual intercourse was the begetting of offspring. Even then, a degree of remorse was expected. According to him and a multitude of medieval theologians, desire was an unfortunate consequence of the fall. Adam and Eve, it was believed, had irrevocably corrupted everything. Lust, they maintained, was not synonymous with love. Rather, it was a testament to humanity's inherent brokenness. Deriving pleasure from sexual intimacy, they argued, was evidence of sin residing within the flesh, an impurity that no amount of prayer could expunge. You catch the gaze of a woman situated 2 rows ahead, whose expression appears to hover between suppressed laughter and tears. It is difficult to ascertain her true emotion. Perhaps she is recalling the preceding evening, or perhaps, like yourself, she is simply exhausted by the inherent contradictions. Everyone is expected to marry, raise families, and populate the Christian realm, yet simultaneously maintain the pretense that sexual relations are a joyless, guilt-ridden obligation that should never be savored. It is akin to being instructed to bake a cake without tasting the batter, or allowing oneself a smile during the process. Nevertheless, the Church did not disregard carnal relations, rather it fixated upon them. Monks penned scholarly treatises detailing the perils of nocturnal emissions, a phenomenon they termed pollution, presumably because involuntary arousal was attributed to demonic intrusion into one's dreams. Extensive theological debates arose concerning whether married couples were permitted to engage in sexual activity on Sundays, feast days, or during periods of Lent. The general consensus was typically no, though exceptions were occasionally made for dire necessity, provided contrition followed. Brother Peter, a friar whose writings you encountered, argued that even married couples who harbored excessive affection for each other were culpable of sin if their tenderness led to pleasure. I say, cautioned that immoderate joy within the marital union would invariably soften the heart and weaken the spirit. One can only speculate about the nature of his own sleeping arrangements, likely consisting of a wooden plank and a disposition to match. Nevertheless, not all ecclesiastics were entirely averse to the pleasures of life. A few discreetly acknowledged that desire was a natural, even beneficial, aspect of marriage. Some theologians posited that the affection between spouses was a divine gift, a means of strengthening the couple's bond through adversity, but their voices constituted a minority. The prevailing sentiment reinforced the equation of lust with sin, casting suspicion upon the body and even greater opprobrium upon one's thoughts. Furthermore, self-gratification was strictly forbidden. Here is another curious fact for your evening's consideration. In specific locales, the church advised married couples to abstain from sexual intercourse for 40 days preceding Easter, 30 days prior to Christmas, 7 days before partaking in communion, and on all feast days, which were numerous. When one accounts for menstruation, pregnancy, postpartum recovery periods, and designated fasting seasons, the average medieval couple had merely between 5 and 10 occasions per year for guilt-ridden, nervously executed intimacy at most, and under no circumstances were they permitted to derive enjoyment from these encounters. Concurrently, the very institution that preached against lust in its sermons also financed exquisitely illuminated manuscripts depicting Adam and Eve blushing beneath their fig leaves, demons molesting monks in their sleep, and even naked saints resisting temptation while unclothed. The inherent contradiction in these messages is almost comical, were it not for its detrimental impact. On one hand, sexuality was portrayed as perilous. On the other, visual representations of near sexual encounters were circulated. The debate persists within academic circles. Some scholars assert that medieval Christians internalized these doctrines, leading lives marked by repression and shame. Others suggest that individuals merely feigned adherence in church before resuming their usual activities. After all, ample evidence exists in confessions, court records, and poetry detailing desire, scandal, and thoughts far from pious. It is plausible that people learn to navigate these dual realities, maintaining a facade of piety by day while indulging in passion by night. Back within the church, the priest begins to conclude his sermon, his tone softening as he implores the congregation toward repentance. Guard your thoughts, he urges, for they are the seeds of action. Even a single covetous glance can herald the onset of eternal damnation. You survey the assembled crowd once more, and it becomes evident that no one present is entirely free from guilt. Indeed, that seems to be the underlying objective. Foster their shame, and they will. Return. Continue to confess. Continue to give. Continue to trust. You slip away through the rear exit as the choir commences its song. Voices reverberate off the stone in solemn melodies. Outside, the sun blazes, and the street carries the aroma of life. Sizzling onions, fresh baked bread, unwashed bodies, and the scent of horses. You draw a deep breath. The church may have attempted to suppress every human impulse, but in the open air, people continue to kiss, continue to love, continue to seek intimacy behind haystacks. Next, you will follow some of those furtive glances into the more discreet parts of society, where same-sex affection quietly, persistently existed beneath the veneer of a world that denied its presence. The city constricts around you, leading you into quieter districts, narrow lanes overshadowed by towering stone edifices, places where fewer eyes observe and hushed words travel further than footsteps. You have departed from the sermons and public condemnations, extricated yourself from the town square where transgression is loudly denounced, and entered a domain of subtle rebellion. This is where the truths that no one dares to utter still manage to endure. Same-sex love in the Middle Ages was not merely prohibited, it was declared inconceivable. Yet here you are, traversing the very streets where it persevered regardless. Resilient, like ivy threading through fissures, you observe two young men seated near a fountain, their shoulders almost brushing. Their discourse is low, appearing casual, but the way they regard each other conveys a wealth of unspoken sentiment, a fractionally longer gaze, a smile that is too timid. No one would register their connection unless they were scrutinizing them intently. And therein lies the secret, does it not? In a society that insists this love is non-existent, the key to survival is remaining unnoticed, or being noticed just enough to blend in. The church's official doctrine was straightforward. Homosexuality was equated with sodomy, and sodomy was a transgression so profound it ranked just below heresy and witchcraft. Punishments ranged from public atonement to mutilation, exile, or execution. However, the church also failed to precisely define it. Despite all the fear-mongering, they did not truly comprehend what they were condemning. Was it desire itself? Was it the act? Could two individuals of the same gender experience love for one another without committing a sin? The inherent vagueness created space for inconsistencies and for survival. Medieval legal documents are interspersed with accounts that allude to a hidden existence, A cleric discovered penning ardent epistles to a fellow cleric. A nun reassigned due to excessive closeness with another sister. A municipal magistrate penalized for hosting improper diversions in his private garden. One man was brought before the tribunal in Florence for embracing another in a manner befitting a lover. The record is silent on subsequent events, as it often is, but not every narrative concludes with retribution. In certain enclaves of the medieval world, particularly in metropolises such as Venice, Florence, and Paris, same-sex affection thrived beneath layers of denial and artful indirectness. You encounter the term fraternitas, signifying brotherhood, employed in records detailing unusually profound male camaraderie. Within convents, amicitia, or spiritual fellowship, was a favored designation for deep, emotionally intertwined relationships between women. Were these interactions purely platonic? Perhaps, perhaps not, but they provided a secure avenue to express, "I hold you dear," without attracting undue scrutiny. One of the most striking instances you come across involves John and William, two Englishmen from the 14th century apprehended for cohabiting as spouses. The documentation is sparse, but it is evident they possessed some form of mutual commitment, shared possessions, a shared sleeping space, a shared public standing. The authorities were somewhat perplexed about how to proceed. They were fined, released, and largely left unmolested, an anomaly rather than the norm, but a glimmer of hope nonetheless. And then there is the poetry, so much of it concealed in plain sight. You discover a Latin verse composed by a monk for his cherished companion, imbued with a yearning too delicate to be anything other than romantic. "When I behold you, my heart is agitated," he writes. "When you depart, my spirit retreats into quietude." It is plausible to interpret this as spiritual longing, but the manner in which he describes the other man's lips, his hands, his fragrance, makes it difficult to overlook the underlying reality. In another convent, a sister named Agnes penned numerous letters to a fellow nun, Beatrice. She referred to her as my reflection, my joy, and the sole sanctuary for my spirit. Their correspondence survives solely because someone, quite possibly a less benevolent superior, transcribed them into a volume of perilous affections, which ironically preserve their story. And here is an intriguing detail for your consideration. In 14th century France, some men in same-sex unions participated in simulated marital ceremonies, complete with rings, pledges, and even dowries. These ceremonies were conducted clandestinely, often under the guise of festivals or carnivals where established norms were more flexible. Naturally, if apprehended for Malmö, they faced condemnation as blasphemers. But for that singular night, they were permitted to engage in pretense. Even within the church, matters were not as rigidly defined as the preachers asserted. Certain monastic communities permitted deep same-sex bonds provided they were expressed through correspondence or verse and not, you understand, physically acted upon. The Brothers of the Common Life, for instance, fostered emotional closeness among their male students as a manifestation of spiritual fraternity. Was this a guise for something more? Possibly. Or perhaps it represented an endeavor to carve out an existence where intimacy was not immediately stigmatized as sin. A significant academic disagreement exists regarding whether these intense same-sex relationships were genuinely romantic and erotic, or if modern interpreters are projecting contemporary sensibilities onto the past. Some historical scholars contend that medieval individuals possessed distinct frameworks for love, and what appears romantic to us today was merely profound emotional connection. Conversely, others suggest that I am pristine, I possess affluence, or at times I am prepared. She proclaimed it passed through the wall and seized her in her slumber. It bore the likeness of her husband, yet its eyes blazed, marked by hell. Dominorum, Lady of Dreams, on the secrets of women. The womb possesses 7 chambers, better to spill than to swell. It's different out here, he mumbles, looking away. On the road. You've heard that before. Pilgrimage, with all its spiritual baggage, also brought anonymity. New towns, no relatives watching, and in many cases no real oversight, which means that people who left home to purify themselves often found themselves neck-deep in the very sins they claimed to flee. In one roadside tavern, you witness a knight drinking heavily, boasting that he's taking the cross, but his hand is firmly planted on a barmaid's thigh. Nearby, 2 supposed pilgrims play dice for a girl's scarf, possibly stolen, definitely scented. These travelers aren't all holy. Many are bored, some are broke. More than a few are looking for redemption in the same place they're also looking for flesh. A surprising number find both in the same bed. This isn't some fringe phenomenon. Towns along pilgrimage routes had entire economies built around servicing the bodies of pilgrims, not just feeding and housing them, but offering companionship of a less than holy nature. Temporary brothels popped up like mushrooms along the trail. Some were disguised as bathhouses, others didn't bother pretending. And in Jerusalem itself, crusaders were famously accompanied by a retinue of camp followers, many of them sex workers who marched just behind the banners of the cross. In fact, when King Richard the Lionheart led his crusade to the Holy Land, he didn't just bring knights, he brought women, a lot of women. Some were noble companions, others were washerwomen, the preferred euphemism for traveling lovers, paid or not. Church leaders huffed and puffed, of course, but nothing much changed. Crusades were months, even years long. Men wanted release, women wanted protection, food, or sometimes just the chance to escape their past. Sex wasn't the exception on these journeys, it was routine. You flip through a soldier's diary, carefully preserved in a German abbey, and find an entry that reads, "We prayed at the tomb of Christ, and after, I lay with a girl from Acre. She smiled as if I had blessed her." It's not regret, it's remembrance, and it tells you everything. The holy mingled with the profane so thoroughly that sometimes even the pilgrims couldn't tell the difference. And it wasn't just straight-laced knights falling into temptation. Monks and priests traveled too, and many saw pilgrimage as a loophole. Far from their bishops, their abbots, their parishioners, they could sin quietly and return repentant. One friar from Avignon was known to travel with a cousin who mysteriously resembled a young novitiate in a borrowed dress. They switched roles in different towns. He heard confessions, she called them. And here's a fringe fact you'll wish wasn't true. In some cases, brothels along pilgrimage routes operated with church protection. In exchange for regular donations or strategic silence, certain orders looked the other way. A few even collected penance fees from pilgrims who confessed to visiting these places, then turned around and collected taxes from the establishments themselves. That's medieval capitalism at its finest, but it wasn't always transactional. On the road, emotions ran high. You meet a woman named Beatrix, a weaver from Valencia, who claims she fell in love with a Breton pilgrim somewhere outside Genoa. He said he'd write. She shrugs. But letters don't walk. I did not sin, but I was not holy either. Looking for something special, to cure or to cause? Boil this and have him drink it before dusk. If his eyes linger on your lips afterward, it worked. Monk's breath. Inside, dried parsley and powdered gallnut. You're told it's good for cooling an overactive libido, given by cautious wives to pious husbands or nervous nuns to themselves. Nearby, a small vial marked with a crude heart shape holds an infusion of mandrake root. This one's famous. Mandrake, with its vaguely human shape and eerie shriek when pulled from the ground, was said to stoke passion and create an almost mystical hunger. It was also rumored to grow beneath gallows, nourished by the final emissions of hanged men. Romantic? No. And it wasn't all about seduction. Some potions were meant for revenge. You find one recipe titled, "To sour a man's blood. Your absence wounds me like a blade, and your letters are my only bandage, son of no one. My mother gave me her name, my father gave me his coin. That's enough." You realize that for many, survival meant finding power in the margins. Bastards weren't necessarily doomed, they were just uninvited to the table. Some found ways to climb in through the side door. Others built new tables entirely. There's an open scholarly debate about how widespread social mobility really was for illegitimate children. Were exceptions like William or Thomas rare sparks in a bleak landscape? Or was society more flexible than we give it credit for? Some evidence suggests that particularly in cities, bastardy lost some of its stigma over time, especially if the child could be useful, talented, or married off. Discreetly, others argue that the stain of illegitimacy clung tight no matter how well someone performed. You leave the manor house quietly, careful not to wake anyone. The nursemaid hums softly to the newborn in the lower room. Upstairs, the nobleman is asleep beside his lawful wife, dreaming perhaps of neither. Somewhere in between, a life has just begun, unwanted in one sense, but not unloved, and that may be the real secret here. For all the laws and shame, hearts still found ways to break the rules. Next, you'll slip into more radical spaces where heretics preach salvation through sex, couples share each other as property of the divine, and free love means something far older and stranger than Woodstock ever imagined. You've wandered far off the main road now, past the manors and monasteries, beyond the reach of bishops and barons. You're in a clearing ringed by trees that seem to lean in just a little too close, as if they've heard something they shouldn't repeat. There's a small gathering around a fire, men and women, young and old, cloaked in simple wool and quiet defiance. One woman sings softly, her voice weaving through the smoke. Another reads from a scroll not recognized by any official church. You've found the heretics, the radicals, the ones who dared to make sex and salvation and weren't all that sorry about it. Welcome to the fringe movements of medieval Christianity, where doctrine is loose, desire is spiritual, and nothing is quite what it seems. You're about to meet people who believed fervently that God lived not in celibacy, but in the body, that the divine could be accessed through touch, and that denying pleasure was the real sin. You sit beside a man named Elias, broad-shouldered and intense, with fingers stained from copying texts. He tells you he's part of the Brethren of the Free Spirit, a loosely organized, wildly controversial movement that gained traction across parts of the Holy Roman Empire and Low Countries in the 13th and 14th centuries. Their core belief that once a soul was truly united with God, it transcended sin, which meant that anything they did, anything, was no longer sinful, including sex, especially sex. The church, predictably, was horrified. The Brethren rejected sacraments, ignored clerical authority, and most outrageously, some of their members claimed to be literally divine. "I am God," one female mystic allegedly said, "and everything I do is holy." You imagine how well that went over in Rome. But the idea spread. One woman, Margaret Porret, wrote a mystical treatise called The Mirror of Simple Souls, which argued that the soul must surrender to divine love completely, even if that meant abandoning moral law. The church burned her at the stake in 1310, but her book kept circulating underground. Scholars still debate whether she practiced sexual mysticism herself, but others certainly did. You hear about sects where members stripped naked during rituals, both symbolic and literal acts of shedding sin. In some communities, couples shared each other as expressions of divine unity. One heretical group believed that true purity came only after full indulgence, that you had to experience all earthly pleasure before you could be truly free of it. Imagine explaining that to your confessor. And here's your fringe fact for the night. In 14th century Bohemia, a radical sect called the Adamites lived communally, rejected clothing entirely, and believed that prelapsarian nudity, that is, the naked state of Adam and Eve before the fall, was the purest form of existence. They danced, sang, and slept together in the open, claiming they had returned to Eden. The church sent troops. It did not end well. You listen as a woman named Clara speaks. She's in her 30s with a crescent-shaped scar at her temple and eyes that watch everything. She talks about love, not just romantic love, but sacred love. The flesh, she says, is the scroll where God writes. For her, sex isn't just human, it's holy. She describes how in certain rituals, lovers recite psalms during climax, how prayer becomes a kind of foreplay, how kissing, when done with intention, becomes a sacrament. Not everyone in the group practices this sovereignly. Some still wrestle with guilt. Others walk both worlds, attending Mass by day, then returning to the woods by night. And yet, you sense a quiet conviction among them. They're not rebelling for the thrill. They genuinely believe that desire, when embraced honestly, brings them closer to the divine. Of course, the institutional church saw this as a threat. Not just the theology, but the liberation. If people didn't fear sin, how could you control them? If women claimed sexual autonomy as spiritual truth, how could you silence them? And perhaps most terrifying of all, if peasants and wanderers could find salvation without priests or confession, what was left for the hierarchy to do? Inquisition records from France and Germany are filled with frenzied accounts of these groups. But the line between truth and slander is thin. Did the Brethren really engage in orgies, or were they accused of it? because they dared to question authority. Were the Adamites dangerous or just inconveniently naked? Even modern scholars can't agree. Some see these movements as proto-feminist, proto-egalitarian responses to a repressive church. Others argue they were chaotic, misguided, and occasionally exploitative. You meet a young couple, Mira and John, who've been living among the Free Spirit followers for 2 years. They tell you they used to be married in the official church. There was love, Mira says, but no freedom. Here, they sleep with other partners sometimes together, sometimes not. But always with consent, John adds, always with grace. You can't tell if it's working, but they look content, not ecstatic, not ashamed, just peaceful in their bodies. Still, the risk is real. If they're caught, they could be tortured, executed, erased. One former member was burned for claiming unity with God through fornication. The word fornication was underlined in red ink, probably by someone with more fear than understanding. You realize how radical it truly is to take something the church labeled shameful and claim it as holy. To say, my pleasure does not condemn me. It resonates with the divine. That's a potent form of thought, truly transformative. Perhaps it's the very reason these concepts resurface throughout historical epochs, like resilient wildflowers. You can scorch them, entomb them, or denounce them, yet they invariably re-emerge. You depart the clearing beneath a sky awash with starlight. A gentle melody drifts from behind you, and the fire's crackle mirrors a steady pulse. While their convictions may not be your own, you grasp their essence. Because in a world governed by control, the most sacred act can simply be an unashamed desire. Next, you find yourself within the hallowed confines of monasteries and convents. Here, abstinence reigns, yet yearning permeates the silent air. Saints envision tender embraces, and monks meticulously carve their remorse into stone. The village recedes as the trees thin, revealing a modest stone chapel and an adjacent cluster of low-lying buildings braced against the elements. A profound tranquility pervades, with orderly rows of herbs flanking a weathered wall, and a placid cow grazing in a paddock, seemingly indifferent to your presence. Yet, beneath this serene facade, an undercurrent of unease lingers, an almost imperceptible tension suspended in the atmosphere. You've arrived to investigate one of medieval history's most peculiar fixations, the animal trials. Here, humanity projected its own carnal appetites, its profound shame, and its irrational moral anxieties onto defenseless creatures. Indeed, during the Middle Ages, animals faced judicial proceedings, complete with presiding judges, witness testimonies. The accusations often seemed lifted from the most fevered pages of monastic manuscripts. Remarkably, many such proceedings, as improbable as it may sound, concerned matters of intimate conduct. Picture a dim church tribunal where heavy incense fails to overwhelm more earthy odors. At the center, a disinterested pig stands tethered near the bar, its occasional grunts interrupting the solemn proceedings. The charge, moral impropriety involving a youth. A cleric unfurls the indictment with trembling hands, his voice thick with righteous fervor. The assembled villagers nod gravely. One longs to protest the spectacle. The pig, oblivious, nuzzles at the straw. This was no aberration. Across medieval Europe, formal trials were conducted against creatures great and small. Swine, cattle, even insects, all granted the full solemnity of legal process. Roosters were brought before tribunals, facing charges that frequently involved illicit sexual conduct. In the year 1386, in the town of La Flèche, France, a pig, adorned in human attire, was prosecuted for murder and indecent acts, subsequently being publicly executed by hanging. In a separate instance, a donkey underwent scrutiny for alleged illicit relations with a farmer. However, in a remarkable turn of events, the donkey was exonerated, as multiple individuals testified to its inherent modesty and virtuous disposition. Yes, this is genuinely factual. You settle beside an elderly scribe, diligently recording the day's proceedings. He emits a profound sigh and explains that despite their current perceived absurdity, these trials were matters of grave consequence at the time. To the medieval sensibility, animals were not merely brute creatures, they were integral components of God's divinely ordained creation. Any deviation from this established order by a creature necessitated punishment lest divine retribution falter. In essence, they were not solely penalizing the pig, they were striving to re-establish cosmic equilibrium, or at least create the illusion of doing so. Naturally, deeper currents were at play. Beneath the veneer of these animal prosecutions lay a tangled web of human emotions, ingrained guilt, the act of projection, and suppressed desires. In numerous instances, it seems highly probable that the animals served as convenient scapegoats, readily available targets when the actual transgressions proved too horrific to confront directly. A child discovered deceased? Blame the goat. A woman found with unexplained injuries? Implicate the dog. The true perpetrators, often neighbors, kin, or figures of authority, remained unpunished or unmentioned. And here's your peculiar fact for the evening. In 1474, a rooster in Basel, Switzerland, was subjected to a trial for the inexplicable act of laying an egg, a feat no rooster is capable of accomplishing. The egg was subsequently declared an infernal artifact, and the rooster met its end at the stake. Medieval society harbored the belief that a rooster's egg could gestate a basilisk, a monstrous entity whose very gaze was fatal. One can almost picture the clergyman meticulously noting this in his ledger before seeking solace in a robust libation. The church actively contributed to fostering these apprehensions. Sermons frequently cautioned that carnal transgression could contaminate the surrounding world, suggesting that even animals could become conduits for corruption. One particularly inventive orator asserted that demons frequently possess livestock to engage in depraved acts and to ensnare the faithful. This implied that your cow's lascivious gaze was, in fact, the devil's handiwork. There's a discernible rationale behind the inclusion of peculiar moralistic fables alongside zoological descriptions in medieval bestiaries. The lion symbolized nobility, the owl represented wisdom, the weasel was characterized as an amorous rogue, and the hedgehog was depicted as a hoarder of both fruit and sis. Everything carried symbolic weight, frequently sexual and invariably terrifying. Scholars have endeavored to comprehend this medieval societal aberration. Some posit that it reflects a deep-seated apprehension regarding control over the physical body, the domestic sphere, and the natural world itself. Animals, in this interpretation, served as symbolic surrogates for primal urges that could not be openly articulated. Others maintain it was a mechanism for reinforcing societal hierarchies. The act of conducting a trial, even a perfunctory one for a pig, served as a stark reminder to all that authority and justice originated from those in power. The court rendered its judgment, and the populace bore witness. Order was ostensibly restored, however theatrically. However, a more somber aspect emerges. Records reveal instances of women accused of illicit congress with animals, often based on mere hearsay, prevailing jealousy, or suspicion. These women rarely received equitable trials. They were frequently subjected to torture and execution. Their supposed animal consorts were also dispatched, thereby completing a ritual of public humiliation. In some instances, there was no evidence of any wrongdoing whatsoever, only the unfortunate circumstance of a woman living in solitude, possessing an abundance of feline companions, or declining marriage proposals. One begins to discern how swiftly fear and carnal inclination can escalate into brutal violence when intertwined with ingrained superstition. Nevertheless, not every individual subscribed to this prevailing sentiment. Certain town records indicate instances where juries quietly acquitted animals, or where judges deliberately postponed proceedings until they dissolved into obscurity. One notable case in 15th century Burgundy involved a congregation of rats, accused of pilfering grain. The rats were formally summoned to court, quite literally summoned, but failed to appear. The defense counsel argued that they possessed a right to safe passage and were likely deterred by the presence of predatory felines. The magistrate, perhaps recognizing the inherent absurdity of the situation, permitted the matter to lapse. And yes, this event is preserved in written transcripts. You depart the courtroom, your head shaking in disbelief. Outside, the sky is overcast, and a gaggle of children races past, playfully pursuing a chicken. The pig is led away, its verdict still pending. Existence continues, as bizarre and brutal as ever. You ponder how many of these trials were less about the animals themselves, and more about humanity's own reluctance to confront its inner self. because when individuals struggle to reconcile their own desires and their own shame, they invariably seek an external focus for condemnation: a goat, a young woman, a rooster with an anomalous egg. Next, you find yourself beneath a sky veiled in death, a period when the plague ravaged every certainty, and carnal desire became both a final act of rebellion and a whispered supplication before the onset of the cough. The coughing commences even before you reach the village, a dry, distant sound at first, akin to the snapping of twigs in a breeze. Yet, as you draw nearer, it intensifies, becoming wetter, more visceral, like something being forcefully expelled from within a body. You enter a town cloaked in mourning, though no one has yet had the opportunity to etch the word into stone. The plague has arrived, the bubonic scourge, the Black Death. Label it as you will. It remains indifferent. Its presence is discernible in the air, a fetid, heated aroma, reminiscent of nascent decay. A cart rumbles past, bearing a burden of limbs that seems disproportionate. Someone casts a rosary in its wake. Another individual succumbs to retching. And amidst this pervasive crisis, you discover something unexpected. Individuals continue to seek solace in one another, to maintain physical contact, to yearn for the sensation of being alive, even when death is an immediate reality. The world is in a perpetual state of demise, and medieval people, it transpires, reacted much as many of us might, with panic, prayer, and unrestrained pleasure. Some embraced piety, others surrendered to hedonism, and many oscillated between the two, their disposition dictated by the hour, the sermon, or the availability of refreshment. You seek refuge in a tavern, one of the few establishments still operating, and find it surprisingly well populated. The proprietor, despite a persistent cough into his sleeve, continues to dispense ale. Two gentlemen engage in a spirited debate regarding whether the world's conclusion will be heralded by fire or by frogs. A woman is seated upon a man's lap, exchanging kisses between sips of her drink. And faint aroma of sweat and apprehension emanates from everyone present. You take a seat next to a weaver named Hal, who, having lost 3 of his brothers in the preceding week, has not blinked since Tuesday. "We are all doomed," he states, his voice hollow. You endeavor to resist being consumed by the prevailing irony, but this rampant indulgence in carnal pursuits was not universally embraced. "We had no intention of it," she confesses, her voice barely audible. "We simply did not wish to be alone." Not that night. He is deceased now. She is not yet. After all, bodies were ubiquitous, piled high, nestled in beds, present in fevered delirium. The boundary between mortality and desire became swiftly distorted. Certain factions contended that lasciviousness itself was the vector of the plague, particularly among the indigent. Others asserted that the affluent, through their extensive travels, opulent lifestyles, and excessive indulgences, were the conduits of the contagion. The truth remained elusive. The fleas exhibited no discernment. Nevertheless, individuals persisted in seeking affection, and at times they did so with genuine sincerity. Account surface of couples who hastily wed without priestly intervention, merely to have a name to utter in the darkness. One young scribe meticulously documented sharing his sleeping quarters with a maiden from a rival settlement for a week during the epidemic's zenith. "We spoke little," he inscribed, "but we held one another." That was sufficient. There is no record of what transpired with her thereafter. Yet, amidst this pervasive longing, not all contact was tender. The dissolution of societal structures created opportunities for exploitation. Desperate women were coerced into sexual acts in exchange for shelter. Children were abandoned or sold into servitude. Brothels transformed into lethal traps. There are documented instances of individuals plundering plague-ridden corpses only to return to their paramours without even the basic act of washing their hands. The malady did not merely afflict the lungs, it corrupted the conscience. Nevertheless, even within this moral decay, you perceive an enduring thread of profound humanity. Huddled in a makeshift refuge beyond the town's fortifications, 2 souls share a sparse covering, their fingers almost but not quite touching. This modest physical contact holds a weight far exceeding 100 sermons. They make no pretense of safety, nor even of cleanliness. Their only pursuit is to experience a sensation, any sensation, before the world goes dark. Today's scholars still grapple with the intricate relationship between pestilence and passion. Some posit that the surge in amorous activity was a natural outcome of widespread trauma, a visceral reaction to crisis. Others contend that such desires were always present, merely unvarnished by the ever-present specter of death. When all else is stripped away, the body remains, and the way individuals engaged with their physicality during the epidemic reveals as much about their inner strength as it does about their profound fear. As you depart from the town's confines, the rasping coughs recede, swallowed by the night. The darkness feels oppressive, yet the celestial bodies above gleam with an astonishing clarity. Somewhere another wagon is being filled. Elsewhere, a tender kiss graces a fevered brow. Existence, in its persistent, unyielding nature, continues. You will soon enter the final chambers of this era, a realm of last reckonings and deep shadows, where mortality and yearning converge within stained glass artistry and tombstone engravings, and where raw sensuality inscribes itself into recollection, even after the final illumination fades. The grand cathedral stands before you, a silhouette of stone and shadow, its towering spires piercing a sky tinged with the hues of approaching night. You approach it deliberately, your footwear resonating on the time-worn cobblestones still damp from the previous day's downpour. This marks the conclusion of a journey, not solely yours, but theirs as well. The nobility, the paramours, the outcasts, the virtuous and the wicked. You have encountered them in private chambers, in establishments of ill repute, within the secluded sanctity of cloisters, and beneath shared, often worn, bedclothes. Now you are about to step into the hallowed space where they all ultimately find their place, to be remembered or to be lost to. Time. Within, the illumination is subdued, refracted through colored panes that cast fragmented portrayals of saints upon the stone floor. The atmosphere is thick with the scent of beeswax and ancient prayers, layered like accumulated dust. You navigate past rows of wooden benches and an altar adorned with opulent gold. Yet it is the tombs that capture your attention, dozens of them. Stone sarcophagi are arrayed along the walls and embedded within the flooring, each bearing inscriptions in Latin, specific dates, and the gentle fabrications of commemoration. Devoted husband, cherished wife, beacon of integrity. You pause at one, depicting a knight in full plate armor, a woman beside him, their hands clasped, eyes closed, lips parted ever so slightly, lovers immortalized in stone. And yet, an undeniable question lingers. Did they even harbor affection for one another? Death permeated medieval life. Despite its daily presence, it never lost its dramatic allure. Individuals meticulously planned for it, revising their testaments, acquiring spiritual pardons, commissioning artistic tributes, and even in death, the enigma of sexuality persisted. Who had shared intimate moments? Who had strayed from accepted paths? Who had courted forbidden pleasures and been consumed by them? The Church's perspective on the afterlife was unyielding. Sinners faced eternal damnation, while the pure ascended to paradise. However, human recollection was far from this neat dichotomy, and the gravestones themselves mirrored this complexity. You trace the surface of one memorial, its inscription clearly effaced and replaced. The newer lettering struggles to conceal the indentations of the former script. Legend has it that the individual interred here was excommunicated for maintaining two simultaneous marital unions, one within the town, the other in the countryside, with neither woman aware of the other's existence until the funeral. Reportedly, they encountered each other while arranging floral tributes. The situation escalated, culminating in the violent displacement of a candle. These are not merely markers of the deceased. They serve as cautionary tales, celebrations, and justifications. The discourse of virtue often served as a coded language. Chaste could signify caught in transgression and subsequently repentant. Modest might imply a successful keeper of secrets. One particular widow, interred with a carved lily and the word pudica, meaning pure, was later revealed in legal documents to have operated a high-class establishment discreetly from her wine cellar. The sheer elegance of this deception is almost admirable. All eventually succumb to mortality. Not everyone, however, achieves the distinction of being sculpted in stone as an unblemished saint. Then there is the art. The realms of death and desire shared a common artistic palette. You examine the intricate details of a stained glass window depicting Mary Magdalene, not in a posture of penitent remorse, but rather anointing Christ's feet with her hair, her expression imbued with a tender intimacy that borders on the disquieting. Behind her, a bishop glares, as if perturbed by the moral ambiguity she represents. For centuries, Mary Magdalene served as the Church's quintessential emblem of fallen womanhood and eventual redemption, a convenient repository for all anxieties surrounding female sensuality, transforming desire into something sanctified and taming its wilder impulses. On a nearby column, an ancient hand has subtly etched a small pair of entwined figures, almost imperceptible unless one knows precisely where to look. Their sculpted features are rough, weathered by the relentless passage of time, yet their posture is undeniably explicit. One can only speculate whether a stonemason, perhaps on a dare, left this clandestine mark, or if it was a genuine expression of devotion, a silent tribute, or even a personal remembrance. For despite the Church's pronouncements and threats, desire invariably found a way to permeate the very fabric of these sacred spaces, quietly, persistently. You move with a sense of quiet purpose into a side chapel, discovering a display of death masks, likenesses crafted from wax and meticulously painted to resemble the departed. The majority exhibit stoic expressions, a few even appear to be smiling. One mask features lips parted slightly, revealing the barest hint of teeth. The effect is profoundly unsettling. They say she was a noblewoman who perished during childbirth. However, her private journals have survived, detailing at length her clandestine affections for an unnamed lover. He would bring her pressed violets and touch her face with a tenderness that suggested she might vanish. Her husband, remarkably, is never mentioned, not even once. And here is a curious tidbit for your evening's reflection. Certain medieval sepulchres were designed with what are known as transy sculptures. These effigies presented the individual in their prime on the upper portion, while beneath it lay a depiction of a decaying corpse, flesh above, decomposition below. A stark reminder that beauty is ephemeral, bones endure, and passion, however vivid, ultimately reaches its conclusion here, or so it seems. Yet, even in the stillness of death, yearning found its reverberations. A count's surface of spectral visitations, widows dreaming of long-lost lovers who reappear in the night, phantom touch, caressing thighs, kisses that felt like a chilling breath. Monks chronicled the temptations that infiltrated their slumber, the voices of former paramours whispering from beyond the veil of mortality. Were these genuine hauntings, lingering memories, or perhaps manifestations of guilt? The truth remains elusive. Scholars continue to debate how individuals in the Middle Ages reconciled their dread of eternal damnation with the unavoidable reality of their carnal nature. Some propose they existed in a perpetual state of cognitive dissonance, publicly condemning what they secretly craved. Others suggest they possessed a greater degree of honesty than we typically afford them, viewing lust and sin not as opposing forces but as integral components of the human experience, companions rather than contradictions. Regardless, the tombstones seldom reveal the complete narrative. You exit the cathedral as the resonant peal of bells begins to sound. A funeral procession makes its way past. Mourners clad in black, a casket fashioned from polished oak, the fragrant tendrils of incense trailing behind. Amongst them walks a woman, her hand tightly clasped around a locket. You refrain from inquiring about its contents. You already surmise what it holds. Outside, the wind has perceptibly shifted. You stand at the periphery of a world that once felt immutable, now hushed, save for the solitary sound of your footsteps. You have traced the contours of medieval desire, from the furtive laughter exchanged behind market stalls to the ritualized silences within convent walls, from self-flagellation to illicit unions, from fervent passion to the devastating grip of the plague. You have witnessed how people interacted, how they touched and were touched, how they confessed, denied, yearned, burned, and were ultimately laid to rest. Next, as the flames dwindle and the narrative gracefully recedes into silence, it is time to conclude with a final exhalation, a gentle surrender to slumber, where history lies beside you like an intimate companion, still holding untold secrets. The fire has diminished considerably, a profound quietude settling in, akin to dust gathering on forgotten manuscripts. You sit in stillness, allowing the tapestry of all you have witnessed to unfurl within your consciousness. the low murmurs of amusement in the taverns, the hushed prayers uttered behind monastic doors, the telltale creak of a bed frame that seemed incongruous within the cloistered walls of a nunnery, the rustle of parchment bearing secrets too delicate for public scrutiny. All of it folds gently into the archives of memory. You have traversed a world that simultaneously revered and dreaded desire, a world where sermons cautioned against lust even as saints experienced divine embraces, where regulations were inscribed in stone, yet transgressed in hushed alcoves bathed in candlelight or under the influence of copious libations. You have encountered noble women who discreetly entertained lovers, monks who wept in the aftermath of carnal pleasure, poets who transmuted their yearning into artistic expression, and common folk who held each other close as the final breaths of the plague were drawn. You have come to understand that sin in medieval times was not merely an act. It was a profound sensation, a burden carried, a confession made, and at times an embrace accepted. Perhaps you depart with a measure of skepticism regarding those gilded halos depicted in stained glass, or perhaps you have gained a deeper appreciation for the fact that the past was never as pristine or as dispassionate as academic texts often portray. The truth is, desire has invariably throbbed just beneath the surface, messy, tender, shameful, and sacred. So as you settle under the covers this evening, remember that history is not solely forged on battlefields and in royal courts, but also within bedrooms and along back alleyways, inscribed in love letters and whispered in the rustle of lace hems, captured in quiet, aching moments that no one thought to record, yet somehow endured nonetheless. The illumination is low, the narrative has concluded, and for now, the past can rest.